How the middle class went extinct. We've covered the decades-long silent depression that America's been in, but in this video, we'll dive into Mike Green's explosive paper exposing how policy blunders rigged the game against the middle class, turning America from a land of opportunity into a playground for the elite. So another great paper from Mike Green. I'm going to go through it here. I've highlighted a couple key sections, and I have a bunch of trading view charts prepared as well. Of course, this is in line with the silent depression framework I've been talking about for 2.5 years now. So he starts off by saying the transition from a pursuit of happiness economy that's growth focused to a property economy extraction wasn't a conspiracy. It was something even more tragic, a series of intellectual errors made in good faith by serious people following serious theories. And then he goes off to list a couple of them, a couple of the major examples we will examine in this video. He starts off by looking at labor share of income. Now, obviously, this is something I show all the time, but it's really important to make a distinction here. So generally, labor share of income calculates the total wages earned by every person in that country. But again, what good is that if you increase the labor supply? Because remember, the law of supply and demand, if you radically increase the labor supply, it means that you will mechanically reduce or suppress wages. And sure enough, that is what both parties have been doing, not only through globalization, but also through immigration policy. So total labor share of income, total wages as a share of GDP going back to 1970 is down by about 30%. But the situation's actually even worse than that when you look at per capita wage, which is down 66%. And of course, here it is not all bad. Corporate profits have doubled as a share of GDP. Again, this means they have increased twice as fast as GDP, and the net worth of the top 1% has increased twice as fast as GDP as well. Now, he goes on to talk about a couple key policy errors. So this one allowed public sector workers to unionize, which sounds good, of course, in theory, but the unintended consequence was this created what economists call a double monopoly or soft budget constraint. In the private sector, a union is constrained by bankruptcy. You cannot fight for a wage that is too high because if you demand too much, the company goes bankrupt. While in the public sector, the government cannot go bankrupt. It can simply raise taxes. So who ends up shouldering that burden in a higher tax regime? The consumer or the taxpayer is captive. The result, we broke the feedback loop between cost and value. Politicians needing votes granted concessions that future taxpayers could not afford. And I think nothing is better at illustrating this than this chart. So here's again that per capita wage as a share GDP, which has trailed GDP by 66% going back to the early 1970s. But look at what has outperformed GDP. So Social Security and Medicare outlays, of course, that boomer welfare, those entitlement programs, those have increased twice as fast as the overall U.S. economy. Homeowner equity, of course, pumping up asset values, which is something Mike Green is starting to talk about as well. That has increased twice as fast as GDP. And of course, the stock market, that has grown significantly faster than GDP, about 5 times faster than GDP if you look at the stock market. So break to the efficiency bargain. So he talks about Robert Bork's consumer welfare standard for antitrust enforcement and basically summarizes that we legalized consolidation. You see this everywhere, whether it be in pharmaceuticals or in banking, the too big to fail banks, for example. We legalized consolidation. Massive corporations bought up competitors as long as they promised efficiency gains. We traded structure, which competitive markets where new entrants could challenge the incumbents, for price. Cheap TVs, and of course, Scott Besson used to talk about this. The American dream is not let them eat flat screens. He has pivoted away from that to something much worse, unfortunately. The result here, we crushed the pursuit, new entrants, entrepreneurship, creative destruction. We crushed that to protect the property, the incumbent firms, the existing market positions. This is where the artificially low interest rate policy post-GFC really mattered. When demand came back after 2020, those consolidated industries had the pricing power to gouge consumers. The efficiency gains went to shareholders. The bill was sent to you. So again, going to that chart that we just showed, the stock market has grown 5 times faster than GDP. Now, remember, GDP has grown tremendously in the U.S. here, going back for the past 60, 70 years. What this is showing is that these things have grown even faster than overall economy. And it gets to this point. This is a chart I originally posted about 2 years ago. Actually tagged Mike Green in that post. A little bit of irony there. Here up top, we can see kind of the real economy. So we're taking GDP and denominating it in M2. Remember, that was the broad money supply. What good is 2% GDP if you're printing 5% every single year? So that is what that's illustrating. Personal income, same concept. What good is your personal income going up by 2% a year if the money supply is getting diluted at 10% a year? So examining a somewhat similar concept there. And then, of course, money velocity, which is exactly what it sounds like. That is the speed at which money is changing hands in the real economy. And then, of course, the labor force participation rate. How many people are actually participating in this economy that is supposedly so great? Well, what we can see is that the real economy boomed from as far back as my data goes in the early 1960s all the way up until the late 1990s, where everything started to decline and fall off a cliff. This is the silent depression. Well, something had to fill in that gap. If there's a massive gap in the real economy being left, something has to come in to grow faster to fill that gap. Well, what was it? It was government debt, it was corporate profits, and it was, of course, financial assets like the S&P 500. Now, I also threw in there in the orange line, I threw in M0, the monetary base, denominated in M2, which we can see that really took off post GFC, post 2008. That official government money really started to explode relative to the broad money, which is what used to drive the economy. Of course, private bank credit creation back when banks were down the street and they knew what your community needed. Break three, the China bargain, the China shock, as is widely known, and something, of course, I've been talking about for years now. Capital didn't actually flow to China to sell goods. It went there to arbitrage labor. American corporations bought cheap labor and imported the products back home. The result here was the greatest labor arbitrage in history. We sold our factories, our productive capacity, in order for them to buy our cheap debt, treasuries. That hollowed out the American working class to pad corporate balance sheets, and the China shock decimated manufacturing communities in ways that economists are still measuring. Now, of course, that is the China shock that I've been talking about for a long time now. As you increase your trade deficit, we covered this the other day, as you increase your current account deficit, the other way of saying that is you are increasing your capital and financial account surplus. Well, sure enough, we can see that has been great. When you put a $1 trillion bid every single year from foreigners into your financial markets, the S&P 500 is going to definitely outperform the broader economy. The net worth of the top 1%, who of course own all of those financial assets, they are going to get obscenely wealthy. Now, he also talks about the tax shift here. We also rewired who pays for the country. This was not sold as a transfer. It was sold as supply side stimulation. We swapped a tax on corporate profits for a tax on wages. Back in 1955, the golden age of America, the corporate tax generated 28% of total government revenue. The rich paid indirectly via ownership of those assets. The payroll tax was a modest 8% of revenue. I personally pay much more than 8%. It would be wonderful if we all paid 8%. He is talking here, of course, about 8% of total government revenue, where the government is choosing to tax out of that $5 trillion or so that it gets per year. He's not talking about tax rate there. Then 2024, for the recent example of what taxes look like now, the corporate tax has collapsed to just 10% of revenue. We went from 28% of total government revenue coming from corporate taxes to just 10%. To fill the hole, even as corporate profits as a share of GDP exploded, we showed that earlier, the payroll tax, which hits every worker from their first dollar, has exploded to 36%. And of course, he points out that no, the capital did not trickle down, it pooled at the top. The top 1% own roughly 90% of corporate equity, but pay a fraction of the historical burden, while, of course, the working class shoulders the cost. Then he talks about, of course, the inflation gap. He talks about how there are different inflation rates for different baskets, and kind of goes through and makes an example here with milk, and shows that innovation drives the price down for those that can afford the rich basket, the organic milk. So the wealthy experience deflation. Well, the poor, because of that corporate consolidation that he talked about earlier and that artificial scarcity that a monopoly can introduce, that drives the price up. And the poor experience inflation of about 5% in this example. If you average those two numbers, CPI looks good around 2 to 3%, but of course, it is not uniform. Different baskets or different income groups experience inflation at a different rate. The rich, because costs are falling, they accumulate a surplus. If their incomes rise just at the rate of CPI, they are gaining an additional surplus because their goods and services that they are buying are going down in price. The poor, however, because costs are rising, they accumulate a deficit even if we increase their income by that same CPI. Now, it should be pointed out that inflation, CPI inflation, which is the main government metric to track inflation, vastly undercounts the actual scale of the problem. For example, me as a young American, the cost of the same house in the same neighborhood tripled over the past 5 years. But then they tell me that inflation is only 22%. My auto insurance is up like 250%. It's a joke. Well, here's a way at estimating how much of a joke CPI inflation numbers are. Going back to 1960, we can see the monetary base, that M0, has outpaced CPI, which is again that government inflation index, by 849%. Again, inflation is a monetary phenomenon first and foremost. M2 money supply has outpaced inflation by 600%. Remember, these are relative. So what this percentage over here shows is the degree to which inflation, CPI inflation, is undercounting actual inflation. And then, of course, per capita spending as a share of CPI, that is up by 144%. Now, of course, the volume, that is where that volume of goods and services comes into play. I've pointed out that nuance multiple times. I understand it's not a perfect measure for inflation, but somewhere in between here is where the true inflation number actually lies. We know inflation is dramatically undercounted by the government statistics, by BLS. Then he talks about creative destruction. We'll finish up here. That extreme inequality doesn't fuel innovation, it suffocates it. Children born to parents in the top 1% are 10 times more likely to become inventors than those born below the median income. We have built an economy of incumbency where opportunity is hoarded along with, of course, assets. By locking the next generation of geniuses out of the lab because their parents couldn't afford the entry fee, we are leaving thousands of Einsteins on the table. We chose to protect the assets of the past rather than fund the inventors of the future. I think this diagnosis that he gives at the end is quite succinct. I will end the video here. Hopefully that was helpful, and I will catch you in the next one.